Do you think Abomination smashed Hulk so hard he became Mark Ruffalo? Welcome back to Pod Freak. We are continuing our watch through and pod through, I guess, as it were, of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Last week we covered the first entry in the series, the much beloved Iron Man. This week we are covering the not so beloved second entry in the series, the Incredible Hulk. This movie gets a lot of flack, and somewhat for good reason, but I think there's more good in this movie than people give it credit for, right? So I think that the biggest disconnect is that Mark Ruffalo would go on to take over Edward Norton's spot as Bruce Banner. Now, this isn't the first recasting we've seen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it probably won't be the last. Maybe not. They're pretty stable now, but the point is that recastings happen, right? But I think that the reason that this one hit harder than, say, Rhodey being recast is because Bruce Banner is one of the OG Avengers. Bruce Banner is arguably, maybe not even arguably, maybe inarguably, he was the most famous Avenger prior to the Marvel Cinematic Universe starting. It's a character people know. And it was also the one big sore thumb in the ensemble movie of Avengers once the main characters of these four entries finally came together. And because of that, it kind of seems like it's in Bizarro World. But I tried to come into this movie with an open mind. I didn't want to hold prior biases or issues with the movie against it. I wanted to see Edward Norton's performance for what it was. If you don't know, and I'm not fully versed on this, you'd think I'd do some research to recap what I wanted to talk about before recording, but nope, that's not who I am. But I had read at one point in time that not the only, but a small part of the reason that Edward Norton ended up leaving and him and Marvel couldn't come to terms is because they had very different visions for what the movie was going to be. Marvel, even more so than now, especially back then, just kind of wanted a fun action superhero movie, and Edward Norton saw this as a real big opportunity for an introspective thriller of Bruce Banner dealing with the internal trauma of being the Hulk and how to handle that. The scene that Bruce Banner references in the Avengers where he says he spat the bullet back out, I think that Edward Norton had wanted something like that to be in this movie. So what you get is a little bit of a tone jumbled back and forth. I don't want to call it mess because it seems more cohesive than you would think it would be based off of that story. Certainly more cohesive than, say, Suicide Squad was in the DCEU after its multiple reshoots, or the Justice League movie for that matter prior to the Snyder Cut, which we're not going to get into that. I prefer the Snyder Cut. I don't think it's all that much crazy better, and I still think Zack Snyder's overrated. That's all I'm going to say. This is a Marvel podcast for now. But I think that contributed to part of his frustration, as well as the movie being kind of lackluster. But when you get going, it's not nearly as bad as I remembered opening up, right? Right off the bat, Edward Norton's Bruce Banner is nowhere near as empathetic to me as Tony Stark, despite having a much more empathetic story. But I found myself actually believing Edward Norton was Bruce Banner, which oftentimes, when I think about this movie, I'm just like, no, that's just some stranger. Mark Ruffalo is Bruce Banner. But he really was a believable fit for the role. And even though I still stand by the fact that I think that Mark Ruffalo is a million times better, or at least a million times more likable, I think there is merit in the approach that Norton was going for that doesn't get the credit it deserves because it's not what we've come to expect from that character. He's soft-spoken. He tries to keep to himself. You can tell that he's always running through all of the issues he's dealing with are not becoming the Hulk. Like, you can see his mind and his gears turning in his facial expressions, which is great acting. And the first half or so of this movie is really inoffensive. And as I was watching it, I was like, maybe this is actually going to get really good and this is better than I remember. But then you hit the halfway point of the movie. Specifically, you hit Liv Tyler's portrayal of Betty Ross. Now, I don't want to eviscerate Liv Tyler's performance here, because I feel like that could like cross into demeaning territory, and I don't want to do that. So in a respectful way, I find that the way she delivers her lines sounds very unrealistic. It's overly breathy. She says everything like as she's like as if she is exhaling while she is speaking. And she's just completely deadpan. There's one scene where Bruce Banner tells Betty Ross about how he was able to keep the data that they were trying to get from the college while they were being chased by the military, and her dad, he swallowed it and he digested it, and then he had to omit it back up, as you do. And she comes back into their hotel room and hears him doing this and asks what's going on. He explains the situation and just completely unimpressed, completely unfazed. She goes, "Wow." And it's so bad. And I know that Liv Tyler is a great actress. I love her in the Lord of the Rings movies, but something about this portrayal is just a major disconnect, does not work, and distracts from the movie. Past that, while the early parts of the movie do a lot of good character motivation and setup for Bruce Banner, the latter half of the movie is really just Emil Blonsky going crazy. I want power. I need more power. I'm a great soldier. I need to do all these things. And it's exhausting. And he becomes Abomination. And they have a big, amazing CGI fight, which Marvel does often. And I talked about how I'm not a huge fan of those in the last episode, but it's a superhero movie. That's what you're going to get. But it just seems like after such a great introduction, you bring in characters that completely take away from the immersion and the experience and pull you out of what you were starting to let yourself get lost in. The action and the pacing picks up a lot, and it's all of a sudden you're off to the races a million miles a minute. And the enemies aren't believable. General Ross is more believable than Emil Blonsky, and I'm glad he got kind of another chance to come back in Marvel Civil War, but it's still it is not what Obadiah Stane was in the last movie. And of course, this is a common Marvel trope. It's a common Marvel stereotype. Marvel usually doesn't have great villains, right? That's what people say. And it really is true. A lot of them are the movie would be just as good without them. You could just say this conflict exists, doesn't matter who's causing it. But I think General Ross has stuff to offer here. Emil Blonsky's just kind of weird and off-putting. My only other criticism that I can think of off the top of my head is, this is really a nitpick more than anything, but I don't think they portray Bruce Banner as the leading expert in gamma radiation that he is supposed to be. Why did he not know that he was working on a super soldier serum rather than a gamma radiation thing? How did that lie work? Moreover, if it did work, how would he have created a super soldier serum thinking that he is creating gamma radiation resistance? Like, wouldn't he have gone out of his way to create a completely different serum than what they were actually like lying about asking him to make? Like, you say, Bruce Banner, make a gamma ray radiation resistant serum, and he says, okay, and they're like, oh, we're going to get that super soldier serum. Maybe there's something I missed there. It just seemed like a plot hole that also makes Bruce Banner not look as smart as he is supposed to look. The other thing, in the same vein, if he is the leading expert in gamma radiation, why does he have to contact Mr. Blue for help? Shouldn't he be the one with the most information? And I completely get sometimes there are peers who are comparable. But when they talk to that guy, it very much seems like they are consulting the expert as the person who has the medical condition, as it were, right? Like, he's the patient, Mr. Blue is the doctor. He's got all the questions. He doesn't have any of the answers. And it's really odd. The only scene where he really seems remotely as intelligent as Bruce Banner is supposed to look is the scene where he is creating the injection from the plant that Mr. Blue sends him in the beginning of the movie. Like I said, the better part. Past that, I do think the conclusion is satisfactory. And there's two more things I want to touch on. So before we get to the conclusion of the movie, so I talked about how Iron Man in the last movie has a line that kind of establishes his character journey for the rest of the franchise. He says, I realized I'd become comfortable with a system with zero accountability. And that's kind of like the stick out line to me, at least, of what would be his journey for the rest of the MCU. And I never thought of Edward Norton having, or I should say Bruce Banner, having a character arc through this series because it seems so separated from his origin, right? Because it seems like I'm watching two different people. But they are ultimately the same person in canon. And Edward Norton as Bruce Banner has this great line where he goes, I don't want to learn to control it. I want to get rid of it. Which ultimately would be his entire character arc all the way to Endgame, where he becomes Smart Hulk. He finally came to terms and to peace with this idea that he had to be the Hulk, and he had to learn to control, and he had to learn that this was a part of himself. He had to come to that acceptance, and that's his character journey. There's also some good building on that in Ragnarok, but we'll talk about that when the time comes, like half a year from now, but still, like the fact that he has this almost like a character thesis in the first movie was really exciting to me because it's so easy to think of this movie as a completely separate entity from the rest of the series, right? So I thought that was cool. Going off of that, going back to the conclusion, can't talk. Going back to the conclusion of the movie. In Avengers, when Hulk says, that's my secret, I'm always angry, it seems like he just now, in that moment, conveniently learned to control his rage. But they very, very much so heavily imply at the end of this movie that he had done that. He had almost kind of come to terms with that even in the midst of the first film, that he has to learn to control the Hulk, just not on the same level as he would by the end of his character journey, or at least the end of it thus far, I should say. Because he goes to Alaska, he's in that cabin, he's meditating, and he's trying to get into a specific heart rate stance. And he very clearly, well, not even very clearly, his eyes turn green. It says days without incident all the way back down to 0 from like 30 days or whatever it was. But it's very much implied not just that he is becoming the Hulk, but also that this was an intentional shift that he has learned to implement on purpose, which is really a foreshadowing and building block to what we would see in Avengers. And they still make it kind of seem like it's out of nowhere. They kind of do some hoodwinking and some plot hole writing in that movie so that moment will hit harder than it does, and we'll get to that when we get to the original Avengers movie. But still, the fact that that was established ahead of time is something that I don't think I've given these movies enough credit for prior. All in all, I don't think this movie is as bad as people give it credit for. The first half is amazing, the second half is lacking, but all in all, it's a good, fun superhero romp. I think it just feels like it's in Bizarro World because it's this actor playing this character that we'll never see again, and it is never referenced by the studio execs and rarely referenced by the rest of the series. There are loose ends that had to be explained in a comic that was released ahead of Avengers so they wouldn't be considered plot holes. And it's just kind of weird, but it's still fun and it's better than people give it credit for. I thought I had one more thing I wanted to touch base on about this movie, but it is eluding me as of this moment. So we're going to call that a wrap on the review. I hope you enjoyed this review. We will be back next week with, very excitingly, I thought I wouldn't get Iron Man 2 until right before Avengers, just because in my mind you get the first 4 out before you go on to the first team up, but before you go on to the first sequel, I should say. But no, that's not the case. We are back with Iron Man 2 next week, which is, hey, that's my dude. I'm excited to do more Iron Man content, so I am very much looking forward to that. Before we leave, just a couple quick plugs. You can follow me on Twitter at ClockworthClone. I don't do anything too super promotionally there. I just kind of chit chat, but it's there, and that's where I'll post the podcast when they go live. If you want to follow me on TikTok, which is my main plug, I do video game content there basically every day. My main show right now is the Switch Log, where I'm going through all of my Switch games from least played to most played. I tell you what I think about them, and you try to guess them, and I tell you the answer on the next episode. But I also throw in some other things there, do some of my own spins on some of the trends or gags that are running around on TikTok currently. I've got some plans for some series in the future. You get the idea. But the main thing right now is the Switch Log. We entered the top 10 last week. By the time you're listening to this, I don't know how far we are into that because I don't post one of those every day necessarily. But it's a lot of fun, and I recommend you checking out my TikTok at ClockworthClone, because to me, that is my main creative venture right now. Past that, I don't know anything else to plug. I do want to thank Mance, my former podcast host, for plugging my show on his TikTok. That was really cool of him. He didn't have to do that. He had some cool words. So go check out Mance and the Wrestle Addict Radio if you get a chance. I'm trying to think of, I believe his Twitter handle is at MNDelight. I believe that's it. There might be an underscore. It might be MN_delight. So I'm sorry if I can't remember. If you search Mance Chapel, I believe you should probably find it. I'm sure you can try some combination of those till you find it if you're super interested in seeing what he's up to with his wrestling coverage. But I believe that is it, and we will see you next week.